So, as you know, this evening it's all about looking at ways in which freelance playwrights can try and affect public policy, what we can learn from previous crises that have happened in the past, and obviously this being a Writers Guild event, how the union's role in that. We're very lucky in that respect because Jane Woddis has just launched her new book, Acting on Cultural Policy, Arts Practitioners, Policy Making and Civil Society, which brilliantly explores and illuminates these exact issues. For those who don't know or didn't read the blurb on the Eventbrite, Jane is a cultural policy researcher who has also worked professionally in the arts for many years, and she's an associate fellow in the Centre for Cultural and Media Policy Studies at the University of Warwick and is a member of the British Theatre Consortium. So once I've shut up, Jane will be giving a 20-minute or so presentation all about her new book. And then that will be followed by a conversation between director, writer, dramaturg Aisha Khan, who's worked in theatre companies all over the country. Those include the Royal Court, Royal Exchange, Leeds Plays House, and Freedom Studios, of which she, until recently, was artistic director and CEO. And she'll be joined in that conversation by another writer, former Writers Guild negotiator and president, David Edgar, who this January won our Outstanding Contribution Award and was the force behind the hugely successful new play commissioning scheme. So I think three great people to speak to this topic. And then after they've had a chat, it'll be then your chance to ask your own questions. What we do, just because of interference with noise, if you could submit your questions whenever you're ready to in the chat box and indicate just a succinct question. If you prefer I read them out, just let me know. If you want to speak to that and say more about it, that's fine too. But if I do invite you to speak, then can you make sure that first of all unmute yourself, and then when you finish speaking, please mute yourself again so we don't have any of those problems with sound. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to kind of put this evening's conversation in context. It's a very timely one, not just because of Jane's book, but because of recent changes around Arts Council funding and government policy. So I just wanted to give you some illustrations on where things lay at the moment, particularly in terms of the cuts and changes to national portfolio organisations. So as I'm sure you all know, we've had the closure of Old Coliseum. The Hampstead Theatre has been asked to move its programme away from solely new writing to something more broader. There have been 100% cuts to other theatres, such as the Watermill Theatre, and even those theatres that have retained their funding, just here in Birmingham, where I'm based, the Birmingham Rep, their Arts Council grant now doesn't even cover building, energy and staff costs, which means there's not a penny that actually goes into the work. In fact, by the time they open the front door, the theatre's already operating at a loss. Only while some MPOs have been cut, others have been brought in, but only 4 of those new MPOs have initiatives for writers, and while 12 of the MPOs that have lost their funding had at least 1 new writing initiative. And then just to give you a complete overview of the total portfolio, 88 MPOs have at least 1 initiative for writers, and 114 of them do not. And if anyone saw the recent article in The Guardian about Simon or read Simon Rattle's remarks, you'll know that it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. This is, our government's decisions that they're making. In contrast, Germany has recently boosted annual cultural spending by 7%. France has just done the same and now spends a record £57 per head in France, as opposed to the Arts Council, which spends £8 per head in England. And it's not just about the money either. Where schools are being moved towards the EBAC curriculum, which admittedly, like English language and literature in there, but other than that, art, music, drama has all been sidelined from those qualifications. So we're not just looking at funding, it's also in terms of training, opportunities, education. So that's kind of a broad picture of where we see the landscape at the moment. So what can we do to change it, I guess? And I will shut up now and pass over to Jane.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm just going to share my screen with you, which I hope is going to work. Yeah. So I'd like to thank the Writers Guild very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book. and to discuss it with Aisha and David, and then later with you, the audience. So thank you for coming along to this event. My book looks at ways in which, hang on a minute, sorry, I'm not getting, there we are. My book looks at ways in which playwrights in England have attempted to influence policy on new playwriting in terms of both the public policies of arts funders and the policies of theatres. And it uses this case study to consider the subject of arts practitioners' involvement in policy more generally. In the next roughly 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the history of playwrights organising together to influence policy, then to introduce some ideas about how they've been involved in the policy process, and finally to suggest why this is important, not only for playwrights, theatre and the arts in general, but also why I think it has significance for our democratic life more widely. So I'll start with some history. I focus on those organisations that were set up solely for and by playwrights. So I begin this history in 1975 in the north of England, because although the Writers' Guild of Great Britain was established earlier in 1958, it encompassed a wider range of writers than only playwrights. And as I said, my study is mainly about England, although I do also refer in the book to developments elsewhere and to links between playwrights in England and many other countries. So in January 1975, the first playwrights self-directed organisation in England was created. Northern Playwrights Society, which was inspired by the Scottish Society of Playwrights that had been set up 2 years earlier, set out to combat the situation of the time where, in the words of one of my interviewees, who was an active member of NPS for many years, he said, there was no standard theatre writing contract. People were being commissioned for a couple of £100 to write a play in those days, and there was nothing on paper, no rights sorted out. With a growing membership, NPS soon became an important hub for theatre writers in the region. Then, in the autumn of the same year, 1975, the Theatre Writers Group was set up. This shortly afterwards became the Theatre Writers Union. It was a national organisation with regional and local branches. Set up in response to proposed cuts in the Arts Council's new writing schemes, it immediately began to campaign against these reductions and for better conditions for playwrights. NPS and TWU were followed by other regional organisations, including Northwest Playwrights, Stagecoach in the West Midlands, and Yorkshire Playwrights, now called Script Yorkshire. Nationally, by the New Playwrights Trust, which was later relaunched as WriterNet, and also by numerous locally based groups. As many of you will know, only some of the organisations from those early years are still in existence. But over the years, new organisations emerged, such as the Monsterists and the Antelopes, and more recently, London Playwrights Workshops and Playwriting UK. These playwrights organisations were always clear that a key aspect of their purpose was to influence policy, summed up well in this quote by the Theatre Writers Union, expressing their desire for practical involvement in strategic decision-making affecting the arts in this country. We want to be involved directly, at the beginning and at every stage of the process. The main aims were to promote and develop new writing in the theatre and to improve and protect terms and conditions for writers. From the start, the targets of the playwrights' activities and campaigns were twofold. Public funding bodies, especially the Arts Council as the main funder of new playwriting, and when they existed, the regional arts boards and also local authorities. And they also engaged with theatres and theatre management associations. Now, I've said targets, but there were also partnerships with these bodies, such as when playwrights organisations and theatres have worked together to try and influence Arts Council policy on new writing and funding levels, or when, for example, writers' groups met with the Arts Council officers in the 1980s to ensure that theatres would use what they received in ring-fenced money for new plays and would pay playwrights at the proper rate with this money. The range of activities undertaken by these organisations over the years has been impressively wide. Playwrights associations created and provided multiple resources for writers, such as WriterNet's directory of theatres interested in new writing, and programmes and resources for particular groups of playwrights, including women, Asian and Black writers. Regional associations, such as Northwest Playwrights, Yorkshire Playwrights and Stagecoach, offered script reading services, play competitions and festivals, as well as regular newsletters and forums. Both nationally and regionally, playwrights organisations carried out campaigning research. For example, TWU's surveys of playwrights' earnings, and they organised conferences to raise the profile of contemporary theatre writing and discuss issues of interest and concern, such as the position of women writers, the desire for new plays to be put on big stages, and the need to combat ideas that new plays present a box office risk. And over the years, they also conducted campaigns on many of these issues. In terms of achievements, as I mentioned before, the Theatre Writers Group began by campaigning against proposed cuts in the Arts Council's new writing schemes and sought more openness and information from the Arts Council. They also demanded that the Arts Council should recognise and communicate with writers' organisations. And over the next year, the Arts Council responded to some of these demands, increasing the sums it gave as commissions and bursaries, agreeing to consult with the playwrights about its playwriting schemes, and meeting to some extent at least the group's requests for greater transparency and information. A press release issued by the Theatre Writers Group at this time indicates how startling such disclosures could be. It said there have been immediate practical gains. One writer, for instance, discovered in an Arts Council report that he'd been granted a payment he'd never received. Another early campaign of the Theatre Writers Union, together with the Writers Guild, was for a standard contract. Begun in 1977, it was highly successful and resulted in a standard agreement that's been applied across national, repertory and small-scale companies and has continued to be updated and improved. It's probably one of the most enduring of the achievements of this movement of playwrights organisations. At a regional level, we can look at the example of Northwest Playwrights, and sorry, I put the slide up too soon. When it began in 1982, it had the aim of increasing the number of new plays produced in the region. At that time, the proportion of new plays in the repertoire in the Northwest was well below the national average. But during the first 10 years of NWP's existence, there was a notable growth in new writing as a proportion of the repertoire, reaching by the end of the decade a significantly higher point than the national average, 23% in the Northwest, as compared to the national average of 16%. And a quarter of the playwrights it workshopped went on to write professionally. Indeed, the organisation's impact was recognised externally when in 1988, it won the Manchester Evening News Horniman Award for their outstanding contribution to new writing for the stage. These are just some examples of success, and I hope we can discuss more about achievements and failures later on. I want now to go on to talk about how policy influence was sought and enacted by playwrights and other theatre workers. And I categorise this in two ways: the invited and uninvited. The category of invited is primarily in relation to engagement with arts funders and refers to when arts practitioners are given opportunities to take part in various consultations and reviews about policy, which no doubt many of you have done in the past. The uninvited category covers engagement with both funders and theatres, and this refers to the many ways in which playwrights and their organisations have taken their own initiative to raise issues, organise campaigns, undertake research, arrange conferences and events, all with a view to influencing policies and their implementation. And this was done not only by individual writers' groups, but also, importantly, through networks and collaborations. Because not only did playwrights' organisations bring together individual writers so that they could act collectively within a particular group, but they also, from an early stage, saw the importance of building alliances with other groups who shared an interest in playwriting policies. This meant working with other playwrights' organisations, of course, for example, in the Playwrights Network, which operated in the 1990s and 2000s, and also working with other theatre workers' organisations and with theatres and arts funders. Even though each of these bodies pursues its own goals, there are also many links and contacts connecting them together to form complex and often dynamic networks. These networks operate at different levels and often overlap. Thus, local, regional, and national networks interact with each other, and the lines of contact crisscross among all these organisations and individuals. The other feature is that these different networks operate in a variety of modes. The contacts and connections range from formal to informal, regular to occasional, from one-off events through to long-term partnerships. And a particular aspect I want to highlight is that they cross the boundaries of policy and creative practice. Frequently and conventionally, artistic work is seen as a separate sphere from policy. Even the romantic view that artists are somehow different from ordinary life and the affairs of state still persists to some extent. But in fact, these two spheres continually overlap and interact. The web of connections amongst organisations concerned with new playwriting is frequently manifested in active creative partnerships. And at the same time, these same organisations are involved in a variety of policy initiatives. So their partnerships cross the boundaries of policy and creative practice, weaving together policy activity with artistic collaborations, with each of the two strands informing the other. Firstly, working together creatively can lead to shared interests and understandings, which may then be brought to bear in policy deliberations. The fact that individuals and organisations work together creatively means there are likely to be points of common agreement, shared outlooks and intentions when they're involved together in policy deliberations. And secondly, creative activities can feed into and influence policy, while policy discussions can sometimes lead to artistic collaboration. For example, a meeting in 1991 between the West Midlands TWU branch and the Belgrade Theatre Coventry to discuss the theatre's policy towards new playwriting led to a range of joint creative activities, including script reading, workshops, and the setting up of a local playwrights group. And these artistic activities then influenced policy in their turn. The Belgrade invited feedback from the writers in order to help shape and develop this initiative in partnership. TWU thought the collaboration could raise the profile and importance of new writing in all its theatrical forms. So I'm proposing that there's a close link between the existence of active collaborative networks and the capacity of practitioners to make an input into policy development and implementation. It's my argument that it's within such networks that the channels of communication and influence can more easily be opened and maintained to allow the participation of practitioners in the creation and implementation of policy. These networks are thus one of the key ways in which theatre practitioners are able, through their own actions, to increase their access to and influence on the policy process. And that, I would argue, is what playwrights, through organising in their own self-help movements, have often succeeded in doing. I want to finish by taking a wider view of where playwrights organisations fit into our society and what role they play in our democratic life. My book proposes that beyond the reasons of improving writers' working conditions and of ensuring the theatre repertoire has a healthy input of new plays, playwrights organisations contribute to keeping our democracy alive and active. I argue that the collective organisation and activities of playwrights and other theatre workers are part of civil society. And by civil society, I mean that sphere of social existence that's distinct from both the state and the market. It's made up of voluntary organisations, networks and movements, and is characterised not only by its institutions, but also by its relationships, its values and its practices. The idea of civil society emphasises civic engagement, pluralistic organisation, cooperative activity, open debate, and shared decision-making, and it allows for differences of opinion and identity. Civil society is essential for maintaining and enlarging democratic life. And if you might have any doubts about this, consider the targets of anti-democratic politicians and regimes. Civil society organisations and movements find themselves restricted, monitored, even closed down. And this has become especially apparent in a range of countries recently, including here in the UK, where we've seen increasing attempts by this government to intervene in our cultural infrastructure and discourse, such as placing political appointees in key cultural organisations or instructing museums on how they should be presenting statues and other artefacts. So I'm suggesting that we consider arts practitioners and their organisations to be part of the makeup of the civic arena, and that their involvement in policymaking is therefore not only a matter of arts workers' own narrow self-interest, but contributes also to the maintenance and enlargement of democratic life more widely. That's all I'm going to say for now, and I look forward to discussing these, and I'm sure many other aspects and issues in the rest of this evening's event. Thank you. Tim, you're not unmuted.
Thank you. There's me telling everyone to mute and unmute, and I can't remember to do it myself. Sorry about that. That was wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Can you? Oh, brilliant. That's perfect. Great. So yeah, well, kind of now it'll be great just to pass you over to David and Aisha. David, I'll start with you maybe. Kind of what your first takeaways were from Jane's presentation.
Well, it's a terrific book, and it's a reminder of lots of things that have been achieved, and some of which I've been involved with. So it's also been an exciting read to think, oh, I remember that happening. Oh, I didn't realise that happened the same year as that, and you know, all of that. And I actually counted up not all by the Theatre Writers Union and the Writers Guild, but mostly the achievements and the things that succeeded and things that didn't. And I counted 20 successes and 5 failures, which I think is a pretty good record. But I'd just like to mention a couple which have sort of, for me, interestingly, kind of oblique, perhaps, you know, not just the direct achievement of an objective, but also had unexpected lessons or unexpected benefits. And the first is the campaign which Jane talks about in the book for what we call the Dead Writer Levy, which was a campaign for a notional royalty to be put on plays out of copyright plays. And that was for 2 reasons. One was to level the playing fields, because currently an in copyright play costs a theatre more than an out of copyright play, because they have to pay royalties, but also that could be a fund for new writing. And I was in the Guild actually as well, but I was then sort of more active in the Theatre Writers Union. And we did it together with the with the Writers Guild, and we launched the campaign at the Royal Court, and it was me for the Theatre Writers Union, and the great and sadly late Pamela for the Writers Guild, and we got nowhere with the policy. but I think it had two effects. One is it pointed out, it publicised the fact that there is a financial bias against new work. But secondly, as it happened, at that time, there were talks about the two bodies amalgamating, and both of us had deep suspicions about the other. I think the Writers' Guild feared that Theatre Writers' Union wasn't professional, and the Theatre Writers' Union feared that the Writers' Guild was hoity-toity and superior and wasn't interested in emergent writers. And I think that campaign actually did a great deal to, as it were, reassure both sides. And actually the amalgamation took place 2 or 3 years after that. So it was a completely unintended consequence of something which on the surface failed. And the second example actually isn't the Guild, but is me and Jane, actually, a body called the British Theatre Consortium, which did 3 reports. In the early 2000s, there was a sort of fashion that's been going on in the Academy for some time to say that text-based theatre was dead and that the future lay in devising and collaborative work. And the Arts Council was downgrading its support and encouragement of new writing for that reason. And then the British Theatre Consortium produced 3 reports which demonstrated that was exactly the opposite of what was in fact the case, that new writing had expanded in the repertoire in terms of productions and performances and attendances during the noughts. And that obviously resulted in a change of policy and emphasis by the Arts Council. And I think the lesson I drew from that one was research. And Jane talks a lot about surveys and various research activities that have gone on. And I can't think of one which hasn't actually had an impact on public policy. So I think there are lots of lessons to be reminded those of us who lived through them, and to be informed those who didn't. There are lots of lessons to be learned about how we can influence policy, not always the most direct. And I think finally what Jane said about networks, here in Birmingham, there has been, there's been still is an excellent Theatre Writers Guild branch. It's a big centre of the Theatre Writers Union. There was, sadly no longer, an MA in playwriting at the university. There was Stagecoach, which was a sort of equivalent to Northwest Playwrights, and all of those were operating and their personnel overlapped, and I think reached a critical mass in which the views of playwrights were listened to and encouraged. And just to end with the point I should have begun with, one of the reasons I think why playwrights are a really good choice is that we are a voluntary element in the process. You've sort of got to have actors, and you've pretty much got to have a director and a designer. But actually, playwrights can do their job perfectly easily from 6 feet underground. You don't have to use a living writer. And one of the things that we've been campaigning for over the years is a higher proportion of new work, and therefore a lower proportion of revivals in the theatre repertoire, which has now been achieved.
Brilliant. Jane, I'll ask you to come back on maybe some of that in a moment, but Aisha, what are your first kind of thoughts and impressions?
I think a lot of what David said there as well, but I think the fact that there have over the decades been these organisations who've set out and there has been change from their activity is very heartening. I think that's my main takeaway, that actually organisations like Northwest Playwrights were there pushing ahead and supporting writers in a time when perhaps that wasn't happening, and what that has meant within the arts. I think that's really, for me, that's the key thing. I think looking at what is possible and not forgetting what's been done, and that we can build up from that.
Great. Jane, do you want to? come back on any of that. Or I'll just say, please do start adding your questions in the chat if you have any. Thank you.
At this stage, really, I don't want to say a lot in response to that, because I'd be interested to hear what other people have got to say on those things. But in terms of the successes and failures, I perhaps ought to kind of slightly qualify this counting that David did of, the 20 successes and the 5 failures, because my thesis was about trying to show that where playwrights did have successes, I was more interested in where they did than where they didn't, because I wanted to have a look at how you go about creating a success and looking at an effective role for playwrights. And this is partly related to the fact that when I started the research, and this is back in the 1990s, so my book is based on my PhD thesis that I started in the late 1990s and then updated just in the last couple of years for the actual book publication. And when I began doing the research, what I was noticing was that there was a gap between my experience of working for a theatre company and constantly being invited to take part in reviews and consultations about policy. And yet in the academic literature that I was reading at the time, practitioners were really either neglected or downgraded. And there was a view that if either they weren't involved in policy, the policy was all kind of done up at this level by the decision makers, or else that where practitioners did try to engage with policy, they weren't very effective, or it was seen as a very negative, narrow, self-interested sort of approach. And so I was particularly trying to deal with that question. So that's probably why it might be more skewed towards the successes than the failures. But I didn't, if you like, it wasn't a sort of scientific quantitative survey. I didn't set it. Well, I think it would be incredibly difficult to find the total number of actions that were taken and put them on either side of a success or a failure. So the methodology that I used was what is called theoretical sampling. So I only looked at places, regions where there were already theatre writers organisations, playwrights organisations. So I wasn't looking in areas where they didn't exist, because I was trying to look at what is actually happening with the kind of organisations that I want to look at. And so therefore I was also looking at what the successes were primarily. But I think it is, as Aisha says, it's very encouraging that there were as many successes as I found. And I'm sure there are more that, I wasn't able to include in the book.
And I think it's worth saying that a lot of the, this wasn't Jane's spreadsheet. It was me sort of putting down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just because I found it so encouraging. But a number of them were either ending, reversing, or delaying Arts Council cuts for various bodies. And there's no doubt that there were some organisations like Stagecoach in Birmingham that sort of got a reprieve and then ultimately lost their grant. And I think a question I'd like to know what Jane and Aisha think of, and indeed everybody, I think the big move organisationally, but going back to 1975, the big move since 1975 has been away from specific playwrights organisations towards overall writers organisations, like Writing West Midlands, for example. And so a move away, I think, from a more, from an identifiable group of people who are liable to know each other, working at campaigning in a locality. And the second is the interesting role of the Ginger Group. And Ginger Group probably is too dismissive a term, but I'm thinking of the Monsterists, who are the people who campaigned for more new plays in big spaces, and the people who wrote a letter to the Guardian, which Jane talks about a lot, by 86 playwrights, demanding that every theatre be obliged to present 3 new plays a year. And in a way, the original Theatre Writers Union, which, I mean, our first public act, led by Howard Brenton, was to burst into a meeting of the drama panel and demand to be heard. I mean, it was we started with a piece of political theatre, and then the in a way a really interesting group, which is the Antelopes, which was a group of people who met in the Antelope pub near the Royal Court Theatre in London, led by David Edgar and Robert Holman and Duncan Macmillan, and it was really to have a good whinge about a whole number of issues, which then did very much enter the public discourse about dramaturgy and the televisionization of the process of plays being developed, about writers not being contacted, not got back to, about writers being in an endless development cycle, all of those things which the writers here will know about. And I think the fact that 170 people gathered, not all, I think, at one time at meetings in over a pub in London to debate these things was really important, even though, obviously the Antelopes didn't have the infrastructure that a body like the Guild has. And I think reading your book, what I was thinking about quite a lot was whether, I mean, I campaigned vigorously for the Theatre Writers Union to amalgamate with the Writers Guild, and I'm glad I did. But, there was a bit of a loss there. I mean, there was an element of sort of energy and grassroots activism which came out of a much less formal organisation. And I wondered whether Jane had any views on that, and whether, when we open it out, whether other people feel that there's ways of preserving that sort of Ginger Group activism, while doing so within organisations that have got secretariats and can operate over time, because obviously all of the organisations I've mentioned ran out of steam eventually, but I think they did a great deal of good before they did that.
Aisha, did you want to say something before I come back on this?
You want to come in first? I'm just reflecting on what David has said.
Well, one of the things I was going to respond to that David's just talked about was the shift from organisations that was solely to do with playwriting to a range of writing media. And I think that was, well, I mean, people here would know as much as I would about this, I think, but I would say that it came from 2 directions. That one was from writers themselves, because so many writers, for both for their interests, but also, I mean, but also for their living, work in a variety of media, write for a variety of media. But it was also, I think, driven by the Arts Council, and there was a very definite shift after New Writing North was set up, which for a while ran alongside the Northern Playwrights Society, but eventually the Northern Playwrights Society wasn't able to sustain itself. And subsequent to that, the Arts Council seemed to be encouraging more of these, what they call literature organisations, but that straddle all of these. Sorry, I'm just chucking my speaker around. That they wanted all of these media to be represented by the same organisation. So it was noticeable that a number of organisations who were called playwrights organisations then started to call themselves things like, so like Yorkshire Playwrights became Script Yorkshire, Stagecoach became Script West Midlands. I think one of the Cumbrian, local Cumbrian organisations changed their name to reflect that they were involving a lot of different writers in different forms of media. And in terms of the Ginger Group question, I do get the impression that the kind of the activism is still really important. And I know some organisations that exist now are not operating in that sort of way, but it's still, things still come up where that kind of activism does take place. And I'm aware also that it happens in other art forms as well, that at various times in history of different art forms, different organisations come to the fore, and it includes that kind of activism. So although it's sad when organisations have to close, there's the sense that I get is that there are always new organisations who come up to take their place, but not necessarily in exactly the same form as before, in different forms, and to respond to changed circumstances.
Aisha, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think from just listening to both Jane and David, that I have a question. So Jane's talked about various playwriting groups and organisation which have been absorbed into other groups, so they become writing rather than playwriting. So my question, I think, is something I'm thinking about whilst listening to all of this is, what does that do to the importance placed on playwriting, or where is playwriting seen in the broad sort of construct of theatre, etc.? And in terms of the groups that are out there talking about what's needed, like the ginger groups that have been talked about, I think we have pockets of those around, don't we? That there are established playwrights, those that were mentioned are part of that group, and then on a very sort of local, regional scale, like where I'm in the north, writers do get together and say, you know, we're just writing studio pieces. When will we ever get to write a bigger play? And I think what we have there is playwrights are on the outside of an organisation or a company, not fully knowing what's happening within an organisation and why certain choices are being made. So you do feel slightly on the outside. And I think from my perspective, I've been the playwright on the outside, and I've been the artistic director on the inside of an organisation, so I can see what's going on. And I think with the Monstrous group that's been mentioned, what I admired about them was that they went and talked to people to find out. I think we need to make sure that people know, playwrights know how it all works. So I sometimes feel they don't, and I'm all for like knowledge is power. So for me, there's questions around that. Well, how do we make sure that playwrights, especially if you have no understanding of what theatre is, that you enjoy writing, and where do you start? So that's one thing. And then also trying to implement change, that's another thing. There's all these little steps, I think, that need to be thought about. So they're the things that are coming to my mind when I'm hearing this conversation now, is about how do we make sure playwrights are informed, especially new and emerging playwrights, because this world is very different from anything.
Yes, I think there's also some things. I was looking at, making a little list of things that had been done by the Arts Council which were no longer. And I mean, there are still resident writers, and probably actually the amount of playwrights groups attached to theatres, I would imagine, has increased. I don't know that, but that, I think, you know, I think if I'm obviously the Royal Court has got one, a number of reps have got them, and that does mean that you know, writers meet each other, and because I think Aisha's absolutely right that writers can feel quite isolated and alone, because on any particular project. They're the only one of them in the room, and they don't have the power within the room that the director has, and they don't have the numbers that the actors have. So I think and that's another, Jane's point about networks, I think is really, I mean, obviously there are writers who like to work alone in the garret and not see anybody else, but I think writers coming together almost in any type of organization, I think is of benefit. And that what I think also what Jane's been writing about is consciousness raising. I mean, whenever I say, you know, playwrights are the only theatre professionals who can do their job perfectly adequately from 6 feet underground, you know, people sort of nod, and I mean, everybody knew there were plays by dead people, but you know, just the fact that we are in this very particular position of being a voluntary cost for a theatre, and I think that's, you know, we need to remind people of that, and also I think it's important to, the other thing is to remind people of the achievements that writers have made collectively, which is what the book's about. There was a moment when we were negotiating the £10,000 play with the National Theatre, which had always been an ambition, and one of the national negotiators said, well, the problem is that if we gave you this, what would we do about the directors and the designers? And we did respond by saying that we were all for directors and designers being paid properly, and they're not. But we were there, you know, we were in the room, and we were campaigning for that, and we got our 10,000. It's now 13.5, I think, but it was 10 then.
I'll be opening it up in a few minutes, asking people to ask their questions. But I mean, just responding to that myself, I'm just interested in. I get this feeling at the moment that the old repertoire, and as you say, kind of dead writers as well, is there's less and less audiences for those kind of shows. You know, I've heard several theatres that their audiences are dwindling for the standard repertoire. So it feels like there is enormous appetite amongst audiences for new work, but that doesn't necessarily feel as expressed within policy and funding. So I'm just interested in what you think about the difference between what the funders think audiences want and what you think audiences want, and how playwrights fit in between, I suppose.
Can I ask Aisha on that? I mean, you've run a company. I mean, you know, we constantly get, I mean, in negotiations, we constantly get told by management, oh, the Arts Council demands that we do this, that, and the other. The most recent one is put everything out digitally. And then you look at what the Arts Council has actually said, and it hasn't really said that. But I mean, do you find that when you were running the company, do you find that the Arts Council is encouraging or discouraging you from doing things in a specific way?
Well, I ran a theatre company that was based in Bradford called Freedom Studios, and we had a particular remit. So there were certain things that we did for which we were receiving Arts Council funding. So we ran a young person's theatre company. We supported artist development, that's playwrights and directors, and we produced work in non-theatre spaces. And within that, what was significant was that we were supporting writers who would not necessarily access the arts. So we're looking at South Asian writers predominantly, but any writer that we felt wasn't able to access the arts was our priority. And I think because the company was very clear about what it was doing, I never felt we were being told what to do. We had a clear mission, and we had a clear value of what we were doing and why we were doing it. And I suppose in response to the whole you must go digital, I think for a smaller company like Freedom, the company never had that much money to be able to do everything, say, a larger venue would do. So yes, we could put some things on digital which were affordable as part of a project, but I didn't feel like we were then being forced to do that. It was, does this, you know, we asked certain questions of ourselves. Does this fit the project? You know, is this something that is right for the company? You know, is this going to further the work of the organization and the playwright? And in terms of the work, is it what our audience wants to see? You know, I think the one thing I loved about Freedom was that we always commissioned writers who were of Bradford, of the area, who knew the communities that they were writing for. And so we were very mindful of who our audiences were, and we made sure that the work reflected that in a way. So does that answer your question, David? I've just waffled on.
No, not at all. I think that's very good, and I think that, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure will come up in the discussion is a thing that post-dates Jane's book, which is, you know, the extraordinary change in policy with regard to diversity and inclusion. And, you know, you can sometimes see that as being a top-down thing, that it's Arts Council policy, and that theatres and theatre boards feel obliged to pay attention to it. But you can also feel a huge upsurge from below that has encouraged greater diversity across the sector.
Yeah, with Freedom Studios, that the company already existed prior to all of the work around diversity inclusion. That's what it set out to do. So when Madden Uni set it up all those years ago, that's what he predominantly was looking to be doing. So I think in terms of the work that was delivered by the company and our policies and our values, etc., they were already embedded in the organisation. So I suppose you can say we didn't have to make massive changes because we were already doing it. So that kind of stood us in good stead when things did start to change. We were an organisation who were diverse, you know, right from the board to the staff, you know, our freelancers, people we work with. So it was a plus for Freedom, I suppose.
Jane, did you want to respond to any of that, or shall we go to?
Well, just very briefly, I think what it shows is, and it's one of the things that I think comes out of my book, is that it's a kind of constant engagement between people working in theatre of all kinds of people in all kinds of theatre, and what the Arts Council is driving. And I think sometimes those things are in tension and with each other, and other times one is that the writers and other theatre workers are helping to shape what the Arts Council is doing, and sometimes the things just sort of because of changed circumstances, for example, those things come together from both sides. And so that's why I think the idea of agency for writers and other theatre workers, I think, is something we really need to hang on to recognise exists, and that people can do something about it. And, you know, as the Guardian article that you referred to, Tim, earlier on, it talked about, you know, these are political choices, and therefore if they're political choices, then practitioners can have a say in that.
Absolutely. So should we open up to other people now? The first person I've got here in the chat is Julia Pascal. Julie, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it out for you? I'll give you a second. If you stay silent, I'll assume that you want me to read it out.
You can read it out. I'm happy if you read it out, but
okay.
Yes, please do.
So Julia says, the presentation makes one realise that the Arts Council is headed by those who have no idea about the importance of our work. If we have to educate them, doesn't this make us ask about appointments that are made by this quango? Who would like to take that one first?
Well, I could say a bit about it. I mean, part of the book does look at the question of how the Arts Council operates operated over the years and still operates, and who's appointed, and looks at the time when there were things like the drama panel and the various different committees within the drama panel, and how those were then abolished. And I think one of the issues is that the Arts Council has never accepted, and it's a question for discussion as to whether they should accept, but they've never accepted the idea that people on the council are representative of any constituency. So the artists, the arts workers who are on the council or have been on the council over the many years have been put on as individuals, and usually high profile individuals. So I think that is something that's still very much an issue, but it has been there right from the start.
How can we change that?
Well, I think by having a discussion about it, I'm not sure that there's been much discussion about it since maybe the 70s or the 80s, when there was a lot of discussion about changing the way that the Arts Council was made up.
I have my doubts because, together with Sphinx and many women activists, I've had many discussions with Nick Sirota and others at the Arts Council about equal representation for women, and women not being categorized as diversity. Sounds like we're all singing and dancing. It's led nowhere. It's gone on for about 15 months, a waste of time. So I'm not sure that discussions really have any effect on my own empirical evidence.
Sorry, I meant having, that within the wider arts community, we should be having perhaps we should be having a discussion about that issue and how we pursue it.
Yes, great idea. Thank you.
David, Aisha, any thoughts on that? Or I'm happy to move on to the next question, if not.
Yes, I mean, all I'd say, I'm being Mr. Positive this evening, is that there have been changes. I mean, there's no, the expansion of the number of women and the number of playwrights of colour, and particularly playwrights of colour, actually, has been almost unbearably slow. But if you just look at the programme of theatres in London at the moment, you can see that progress is being made, albeit too slowly. And I think I'm interested in, and obviously the Arts Council is also, that's one of the big boxes that theatres are expected to tick. And so I'm interested, really, as I say, in whether that's a top-down thing or a bottom-up thing. But there's no question that our research on new writing and the amount of it in the theatre, had a huge impact on what the Arts Council politics. It demonstrated they'd been going in a completely wrong direction, towards a theatre in which text-based work was going to be less and less significant. And as we demonstrated, that was exactly the reverse of what was actually happening. In terms of new writing, they changed course. So I think they respond to pressure, and many achievements have resulted from that.
Fab. Got a practical question from Susan Croft. It says, as someone whose focus is now on recording the history of the 1970s and 80s and the various activist campaigns and companies that were part of the alternative theatre movement, I'd be interested to know how well and where the archives of the various playwriting bodies have been preserved. I know the new Playwrights Trust WriterNet went to the V&A Theatre Collections, MPT collaborated with the NW on a number of occasions. I guess, Jane, you might be the best person to direct that to.
Well, I can tell you that the Northwest Playwrights Archive is in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, very well organised and preserved. And I can also tell you that there is a huge archive in David Edgar's house, which he extremely generously allowed me to work my way through when I was doing my initial research. Beyond that, I don't know, to be honest, and it's a very interesting question.
Yes, with regards to the Theatre Writers Union, I should say it was completely disorganised, and now, thanks to Jane, it is an organised set of box files, and it's there, and it would be good to think about what to do with it. I'm currently writing a bit about it, so I'm glad it's in my house, but it doesn't need to be in my house forever. But I think we weren't very good. I mean, Susan's work is extraordinary because it is unearthing material that wasn't well collected at the time, partly because all of us in the 60s and 70s were busy world changing, as we thought, and people weren't good about keeping records, and of course records weren't kept online as they are now. So I think it's great that the history of the origins of much of this is, I mean, if you look again at Jane's book, I mean, the number of new organizations that were created between 1970 and 1976, and new companies and new playwrights launched is quite remarkable, and it's great that Susan is devoting so much brilliance and energy to making sure that history doesn't disappear.
I'd certainly be interested in what we might do to try and find out where various archives are around this, because I think it's very, very important that this information is preserved, this history is preserved. So I'd be delighted to talk about how we might go about finding out more. Who's got what?
Do you want to join in, Susan?
I just wanted to say it's also related to the question of where the plays are from that period, because I know there are huge gaps in the British Library collections, even though supposedly every new play is supposed to be sent there to what took over from the Lord Chamberlain's collection archive. But there are vast numbers, I know, of alternative theatre plays which aren't in there, some of which are in other collections, but then they're scattered and who knows what's where. So I think it's really important the work that went on, both as collectively as organizations, but also so many of those individual plays, particularly in that period before digital scripts, though even afterwards there's still a massive issue as to where those archives are and whether people are submitting stuff. So with a view to the future, posterity.
Thank you. Hopefully we can do something about that. Carol asks, I'm aware now from the press releases I still receive of a plethora of theatres and companies with bespoke new writing emphasis. Is this coming from Arts Council directives, I wonder? Shall I throw that one at you, Aisha? Or whether that's kind of being generated, I guess, by the companies themselves.
I think it is. I mean, I can only speak for what Freedom used to do, I suppose, because that was part of the work that we delivered. We always had various writing programs, because that's part of what the company was there to do. I can't speak for bigger venues. It's been a long time since I worked at a venue in the script departments as a literary assistant. But every literary department would have a script submission service, and they would be actively looking for new plays or playwrights. And I think off the back of that, you'd always end up running writers groups and writers sessions as well. I can't quite remember whether it's an Arts Council director. I'm so sorry, but I think companies that produce new work like Freedom used to do. That's the best way to find writers in the area, I suppose, is to make sure you've got these sort of sessions running and people can come in, because we never had script submissions, so then we have to look at other ways of connecting with our potential playwrights in a way. So that's why Freedom did it. So David or Jane might have a better answer to that, I'm afraid, rather than me.
Have you, David? Or Jane?
Well, I mean, I to a certain extent said it before. I think the Arts Council in the tens and in the noughts and early tens thought that new writing, single voice writing, playwriting was no longer the wave of the future, and partly campaigning and partly research and partly a bit of both led to the Arts Council changing that view, because that just wasn't happening. I'm delighted the Arts Council is continuing to encourage theatres to do new work. There's an interesting thing which I think is coming up, and it's been around in the early days as well, is the issue of whole career writers. That I think there is a feeling, and Lynn Gardner wrote a piece about it in The Stage. There is a feeling that writers are, there's lots and lots of emergent writers. There's lots of writers going through university playwriting courses. There's lots of writers being done, in exciting new writing theatres. But then what happens to them, and a sense in which quite often, in the old days, you'd expect a theatre like the Royal Court to recommission and recommission again writers that were part of their stable. And I think there's a little bit of suspicion that that's happening less for understandable reasons, because, if you're working entirely with a stable of writers, then obviously you're excluding other people joining it. But I think there has to be a balance between encouraging emergent writers and making sure that those emergent writers become established mid-career writers and have whole careers.
I'm just aware we've got 20 minutes left, so I'm just going to we've had a flurry of questions and comments at the end, so I'm going to push on. Richard Pinner, who is co-chair of the Guild's Theatre Committee. Do you want to speak, Richard, or shall I read out your comment?
Well, perhaps if you read the question out, Tim, and I could just expand on the context a bit more, because it was very kind of concise, the question. Trying to keep it right.
So Richard's concise question was, whilst we really have to be encouraged by the initiatives and successes of regional and national playwright organisations over the last 30 plus years, during the same period, there's been an inexorable erosion of financial support from government and local authorities. How can we galvanise our forces to address the effects of this headwind?
I think the other thing that goes parallel and is very much integral to that is, if you look at David's summary of Jane's book, I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, Jane, but I have read the headlines that David gave, and of course it is a litany of achievements on the one hand, but it's also a litany of government cuts and Arts Council administering those cuts progressively through certainly the last 20 or 30 years. And I think alongside that, to sort of gainsay some of the things that David has said, I think that the work that the Theatre Consortium did on identifying the success of new writing in theatre and what percentage of plays were actually from living writers, new commissions, and how they performed at box office compared well to the old canon, if you like. The only thing I would say is that I think there's also a complacence crept in, that kind of new writing, new work is kind of looking after itself a bit. as a co-chair of the theatre committee, we meet the Arts Council and the director of theatre. We try and do this at least twice a year, and I do get a sense of that complacence, and that maybe the work of new writing is not being valued to the same degree as it was even 10 years ago. And I just wondered in what ways, you know, our organisations, both regionally and nationally, can sort of militate against this as best we can.
Who'd like to take that one first? Jane, would you like to? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I was just looking for the unmute button. I think the point that you make initially, Richard, in your question about the erosion of financial support relates back to, in a way, relates back to what I was saying about at a time of increasing political intervention by government in the arts, that actually this financial erosion is also part of that, quite clearly, that it's not just that the government's saying, oh, sorry, we haven't got the money to give you. It's that they're deliberately making a choice about not giving money to the arts. And that's why I was, I wanted to frame my discussion in this idea that playwrights organisations and other theatre workers organisations are a really important part of civil society, and therefore of the battle to try and shift and change these erosions that are going on and these political choices that are being made. I don't want to sort of, or I can't just kind of give a sort of exact menu as to how we should go about doing that. But I do think collectivity is really, really important. And I think all of us have to kind of keep that going, keep our organisations going, finding new ways to collectively get together and take action, for example, when the circumstances require it. But also to learn from the history as well. And that's what, again, that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is to give some of that history back so that we don't forget it and we can make use of it.
It's well, I mean, with the financial thing, I mean, what's clearly happened is, I mean, there's a double whammy, which is that obviously there's been General Arts Council cuts or freezes, which are obviously becoming increasingly painful because of inflation. But there's a double cut for most regional theatres, which doesn't, I mean, you know, there is London-based public funding, but it's not nearly so extensive or important as local authority funding used to be outside London. So, you know, places like, you know, our theatre here in Birmingham has virtually, I can't remember what it was, but I mean, it was, you know, a very substantial sum of it, of its income came from the city of Birmingham, and now virtually none does. And so it's a kind of double hit. And Richard's absolutely right that, you know, without a secure financial base, none of these things that we're talking about are nearly as easy to achieve.
Aisha, what are your would be your top things for kind of either maintaining or kind of reiterating the importance of funding new writing? Oh, you're muted.
I was going to say, I'm of the mind, having been a playwright and then obviously run an organisation, for me, commissioning a playwright and working with that playwright as a dramaturg was the most special thing. There is nothing quite like being in a room with a writer who has an idea, has a passion, and you help them to realize that. And I can understand, I agree with things that Jane has said, and David, and what Richard has spoken about. There is a real lack of funding. I think from my perspective, when I was running an organization, you try and do as much as you can with the fund that you have been given. And we'd always be saying to the Arts Council, if you gave us some more, we could do a lot more. And I'm sure lots of other places would say the same thing as well.
Daniel Rosenthal, I think you want to ask a question about script submissions and evaluation.
Yes, it's not been hugely fully thought through because it came to me just in preparing for this, but it's a question around the script submission, the unsolicited script submission model, and coming at it as being, if you like, a member of a populist group, which is the candidates for guild candidate membership, because we are first-time unproduced playwrights and going through that experience of the script submission process. And a director friend of mine said last week that the unsolicited script submission model is broken in terms of the sheer volume of plays, the number of slots available, the number of readers available for those scripts, etc. So I'm just putting forward, it's maybe a non-starter, it may be something that already happens, and I'm not aware of it, but to put forward to the guild, to other people engaged in this conversation now, the notion of, is there some kind of a hub or portal system that could be funded and collectively promoted by the guild, maybe in tandem with the Arts Council, whereby rather than this process of a script going to 4 theatres over a period of a year and 4 separate readers' reports are submitted and a theatre then passes or doesn't pass, is there some way, because money is so tight and theatres are now co-producing so much because they can't afford larger casts for new work, whereby some kind of a hub is created? It's not exactly the blacklist of the 500 best unproduced screenplays that Hollywood uses, but it's a kind of collective resource where theatre A says, we've got this script, would theatre B, C, D, and E like to take a look, even just at our reader's report on it, rather than waiting for you, the other 4 theatres, to compile your own reader's report on it. So it's, as I said, I haven't thought this through very well. It's just this notion that in the digital age, it wouldn't be the most expensive resource or facility to somehow set up. And I get that theatres are proprietorial about their commissioning policy, or they might be proprietorial about a script that they maybe are interested in, but I'm rambling a bit. But do you see what I'm getting at? Is there some kind of a collective hub approach if the unsolicited model of, you know, one theatre getting 700 plays in their 1-month window, if that model is not working?
Great, thank you, Daniel. Can I throw that one at you, David? Just since you're spearheading the new the commissioning scheme, you might have the most kind of view.
Yeah, well, I mean, the new play commission scheme was something that arose out of the fact that we were sure that, which is true, as we discovered in a survey, that commissions were going to reduce because of lockdown, because the backlog of plays that we wanted theatres to produce after they came back, and commissioning is an easy cut because you don't notice its effects for 3 years. And also there was a fear, which I'm not sure has been realised actually, that there might be a move towards much more conservative programming of revivals. I'm not sure that's actually happened, but for all of those reasons, we set up a scheme which has led to 18 new plays being commissioned, most of which wouldn't have been commissioned without the scheme, in which theatres applied with writers to a selection committee, which Aisha sat on and was brilliant. And we will have over the next couple of years we hope 18 new plays that wouldn't have been commissioned. But I think Daniel's point is really good. There is a precedent for an attempt regionally to set up, I think it was in the East Midlands, to set up a scheme by which new script came into a central pot with an organisation, East Midlands, something or other, and then sort of were offered to theatres. I think he's right that probably the sensible way of doing it is the other way around, but he's also right that, of course, theatres, do have a sense of ownership, and now most theatres, over half their product is going to be new, and therefore it's it's quite a big deal to say, will you share your work? So I think it really does need thinking about. It hasn't been thought about for some years, and I think it's an excellent idea. One other thing that I think is worth saying, obviously writers write original plays. They also write adaptations. Some of them also do translations. And there has been a very heartening increase over the last 20 years in theatres commissioning new adaptations and translations. And I think that's been really important. And then now the question comes is, how does a theatre, if it wants to do Mansfield Park or David Copperfield or whatever it is, or Jane Eyre, how do they find the writer they're going to commission to do that? And I think that's, we were quite surprised in the British Theatre Consortium research, in which the number of plays by women was about 31%, and we thought that the number of adaptations would be more than that. We thought that they would be above the general figure for women playwrights, and they were below. They were quite seriously below, which I thought was interesting, because usually an adaptation is a function, something the theatre decides to do. It decides we'd like to do Wuthering Heights, and then it finds somebody to adapt it. And I thought it was quite striking that theatres were turning to male adapters, despite the fact that there are, of course, now a whole cohort of brilliant and excellent female adapters of plays, of novels for the theatre.
Tim, could I just quickly say a little bit about the thing about unsolicited scripts, because the research that I did, the history, this was one of the issues that kept coming up, was how theatres dealt with unsolicited scripts. And encouragingly, the efforts of the playwrights organisations did result in great improvements over a period. But then disappointingly, things seem to have got worse again. So I don't want to make everybody feel very tired, but it does sort of, for me, underline the fact that, unfortunately, many of these issues are never completely resolved, and you can have a period where things have improved, and then for all sorts of reasons, both economic and social and political, there's some reversal. And so again, it just seems to me to underline the importance of being fully aware of what all the issues are and keeping on organising together to try and change them.
Great, thank you. Just very aware we're now into our last few minutes, so I think one more question from Lisa Goldman. I'll read it out. What do the panel think about the loss of artist curation and replacement by producers at previously new writing theatres such as Hampstead and Soho, but sense of shift more generally, perhaps? Also, what Jenny Topper pointed to as privatisation of those theatres, in that the public paid for them, but they no longer belong to us. Any thoughts on the impacts of that on us as writers? And then Lisa also says, I also wonder if there might be greater activism among writers if membership of the guild was set at an accessible level. I mean, I might comment on that as someone who sat on the finance committee for a long, long time. That, you know, the guild is pretty much entirely funded by annual membership fees. We keep them as low as we can. I don't think we've raised them for several years now, and even despite, you know, and we need our brilliant staff in order to do that activism. Despite that, huge amounts of the guild work is done by volunteers. You know, every craft committee is run by volunteers, as are all the branches. So, you know, we'd love to be able to reduce the membership fees.
Just briefly on that,
yeah, absolutely.
you know, it's a numbers thing, isn't it? And you might be absolutely right that you'd spend all your time servicing people who are paying you 50 quid a year and all the rest of it. And I'm sure you've worked it out. But I mean, there's a huge difference between paying, you know, at the first level, £200 or £198, whatever, but basically £200 a year. And you look at other trade unions where you might be paying £10 a year, you know, and yeah, it is a number, you know, there are a lot of writers out there who would join if it was cheaper. And I know that for absolute fact because I work with writers all the time and most of them are not members. And
Lisa,
would be if it was cheap.
Lisa, what's this union that only charges £10 a year?
Oh, well, the university, the UCU. I mean, it depends. Well, yeah. I mean, and obviously it's all sliding scales, isn't it? It depends how much work you do. But
I can say something if you like on that.
Yeah. Hello, Leslie. Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack.
No, I think it's really. I think it's a really important point there because you said, as you said, it's a numbers game, and the fee that we set for a candidate member is less than the cost to any writer of getting one contract checked legally. So if you have one contract checked in a year, you have spent less than, and that's what we base it on because we do more than one contract per year. So I do appreciate it. And we do look at it all of the time, but that's kind of the cost that that we can't really afford to go below.
Thank you, Leslie, who's our Deputy General Secretary, by the way, for those who don't know.
Just on the artistic director thing, very briefly, Tim. I mean, I think it's a real issue, and it's not just Hampstead and the Soho. The retiring director of the Palace, Watford, the brilliant Bridget Lamour, has wrote an article on the Stage saying, "I don't think I should be replaced. I think that the programme of the theatre should be the pantomime and community work, and that they shouldn't be doing, you know, 6 homegrown productions a year." I mean, without wanting to sound old fogyish, I think that's a terrible idea myself, and I think, you know, theatres need to produce work, but there's no doubt there, you know, and both the Donmar and Hampstead have effectively become commercial theatres, you know, as has the Orange Tree, and very successfully, actually, in running a very successful programme. So it's not, but there's no question that the sort of commercial model and commercial ways of thinking are, you know, are naturally going to follow theatres not getting Arts Council subsidy.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm aware we're a minute over time, so can I ask just all three of you maybe your final thoughts, and then we'll let you all go. And Jane, do you want to start?
Yes, okay. What I'd like to say is actually something to do with the book, and it's by way of apology, because the book is based not only on all the research that I did in archives and so on, but also on a huge number of interviews that I did with many practitioners, and also those practitioners very generously, as well as giving their time, giving me lots of information. And I've been hugely disappointed to find that the book, when it was eventually published, has got a whacking great academic publisher's price tag on it. And so what I've been trying to do is encourage all the academics that I know to get that book into university libraries. And, you know, it is possible, I think, with most university libraries to become an external borrower. So you can go and have a look at it. And then also encouraging people perhaps to try and get their local libraries to get it. So this is why I've been so grateful to the Writers Guild for having organised this, because it was a way of trying to get this information across and sort of return some of the help that people gave to me to the writers community. So thank you. And yeah, and I'm very sorry about the cost of the book.
Thank you. Aisha.
I think I just want to say how privileged I feel to be part of this. I feel really informed by both David and Jane, and by the people who've attended this evening from the questions that they put to us all. And it's given me a lot to go away and think about and do a bit more research and a bit more reading, as well as reading Jane's book at some point as well. And just that, you know, I hope that from this discussion and conversations that there is some movement, that there are these things that need to change, that we can explore that a bit further in some shape or form. But yeah, thank you very much to everybody who's here today as well.
Thank you. David, any final thoughts?
Well, all I'd add is I think what the book shows is that playwrights have had an impact, that it's been difficult, it's been lengthy, it's been frustrating. You know, there are various things like unsolicited scripts that we haven't sorted out properly. But there's what Jane's book says is completely incontrovertibly that the position of playwrights in Britain would not be what it is if it hadn't been for playwrights coming together in various sorts of organizations, and that as a result of that, the position of playwriting is better, much better than it would be otherwise.
Thank you. And apologies to all the questions. There's been lots of chat going on in the sidebar as well, which is fantastic to see. And particularly Adam Spence says, I think this event, Jane's excellent book, and the many important questions and contributions suggest to me that the next step for the Guild is a full conference on the many issues we have only just scratched the surface of. So maybe that's something for the theatre committee to think about, because it certainly feels like there's plenty more that we need to discuss moving forward. So thank you again to our brilliant panelists, and particularly to Jane and her book. And thank you all for joining us. Just to say, if you're not a member of the Guild and would like to join and feel that it is good value, which I promise you, it absolutely is, please head over to writersguild.org.uk, where you can find out about our different levels of membership. And please do join us. And you know, as it is, it's a numbers game. The more people we have in the Guild, the more we can do. So thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you all sometime soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.